to have to learn the hard way, as ours has done. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado reserves the balance of his time. For purposes, the gentleman from Washington seek recognition.
I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, in light of the recent flooding in the gentleman's home state of Colorado, I can appreciate his concern about this issue. However, this amendment contains no restrictions on the scope and breadth of this study, and it seems to be endless. In fact, the study is not focused on the tragic flooding in Colorado, and it's so expansive that it can include all flooding anywhere, and the term oil and gas facilities is undefined. Now, that's what the amendment says. Oil and gas facilities could be interpreted to mean many things, much of which is outside of the jurisdiction of this committee. This could include corner gasoline stations or private gas meters, and, quote, leaking and spills from tanks, wells, and pipelines, end quote, does not have to be associated with natural gas. It can be anything, such as septic or water or sewer tanks and pipelines. Further, this amendment does not specify that the study be conducted in conjunction with production on federal land, which of course is what this legislation specifically deals with. The result is a nationwide study that can touch a variety of sources right down to private homes, the results of which will have nothing to do with the energy production process that this legislation seeks to streamline. This study, undoubtedly at the expense of taxpayer dollars, will have no impact on energy production, and frankly, it has no clear goal. Now finally, the proper place to examine the effects of flooding in Colorado is in Colorado. A testing done by the Colorado State Department of Public Health and the Environment, they found that pollutants from the oil and gas in their aftermath of the spills at 29 specific sites, but no pollutants entered into Colorado's water. However, the incidence of E. coli in raw sewage was measurable and did have an impact on public health, which is clearly not limited to one industry. In fact, it's not even covered by this study. So, Mr. Chairman, for a variety of reasons, and I think I've tried to touch on the major ones that I just enunciated, I urge rejection of this amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, with regard to the language of the amendment, of course it is not designed to apply narrowly to Colorado. That would, of course, be considered an earmark, which are prohibited under the rules of the House. In addition, it's not designed just to serve the needs of my district. What this is designed is to learn from this so that other areas of the country don't go through the same damage from flooding to our oil and gas infrastructure that occurred in my district. The language is very limiting with regard to the report to Congress, very boilerplate language we've used for other studies that have been successfully accomplished by the Academy of Sciences, reporting to the Congress, and I quote from the bill, on the effect of flooding on oil and gas facilities and the resulting instances of leaking and spills from tanks, wells, and pipelines, precisely what has occurred and is as a result of the flooding in Colorado and could, of course, occur as a result of flooding in other areas of the country that have a significant presence of the extraction industry. I hope that my colleagues will support this measure that my colleague, Mr. Huffman, and I have brought forward. I think it would have a common-sense report that would be of great value to this Congress in protecting our infrastructure and our environment from the impact of flooding. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the author of this legislation, gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the full committee chairman. And I want to applaud and commend my colleague from Colorado for his concern and thoughtfulness to the people impacted in Colorado, many of which were in his and Representative Cory Gardner's district, some even down farther south in my district where there was, unfortunately, some loss of life also. So we all share that same concern. To put things in perspective, though, when we look at the oil and gas impact of the flooding, there was no hydraulic fracturing going on during the flooding, and the spillage that was later determined to have taken place was relatively minor. There were about 1,000 barrels of oil and gas spill with about 400 barrels of production water. So that's about 1,500 barrels, which is about 62,000 gallons. Now, to put that in perspective, this was considered a trillion-gallon rainfall in a period of 7 days or so. And that would amount to more than that every second. Every single second it would have 67,000 barrels of river flow. So 1 second's worth of oil and gas in the entire horrific rainfall, I think, puts things in perspective. So I would ask for a no vote on this amendment. It's a lot broader than just the federal lands that this legislation talks about, and so goes beyond the scope of the legislation, and I don't think is really called for, considering how...
How much time do I have?
Gentleman has 1 minute remaining.
I'll yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. So just to conclude, when we put things in perspective, I think that there were a lot more serious issues with the flooding, some of which continue to today and will continue far into the future. Those are the issues we should really concentrate on. So for that reason, I would ask for a no vote on this amendment. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 45 seconds.
Thank you. And I do want to, again, elaborate a little bit on the gentleman from Alaska brought up germaneness and jurisdictional issues. This amendment has been advanced to the floor by the Rules Committee with the necessary waivers granted. So it does not need to go through any other committee. It is here for the full House to consider. I appreciate it being included in the rule. I encourage members to make their decision on the merits. It has been granted the necessary waivers to be considered on the House floor. Again, I do think this study will be of value to Congress if, in fact, the 43,000 gallons of oil don't represent any kind of danger or risk. That will be included in the report. The Academy of Sciences will have access to the information that we as policymakers need, that my state will need for future planning, and other states that have an extraction industry will benefit from in the event of a flood. This can save the health of people, it can save lives, it can save costly infrastructure in the oil and gas industry. It's a common sense measure, a useful study. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Colorado's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 45 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, which state am I from?
Washington.
I thank you.
Will the gentleman yield for an apology?
Of course I will yield, but the gentleman doesn't have to apologize. I just wanted to. I think my asking the question was sufficient enough.
I deeply apologize.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
As I mentioned in my initial remarks, this amendment really is very, very broadly written, and when we had other amendments talking about potential lawsuits, boy, adopting this amendment here would really, really be a litigant's dream if it were to be part of the legislation. So I urge rejection of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair?
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
On that, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in Part A of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Number 8, printed in Part A of House Report Number 113-271, offered by Mr. DeFazio of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Much of the majority's argument here is based on providing relief to the American consumer, and this amendment would provide real and potentially immediate relief to American consumers. 2 years ago in the Senate, in the spring, when we were having a big run-up in oil prices, they had the head of ExxonMobil testify, and he said, hey, don't blame us for those high prices. He said, blame Wall Street. He basically said that 60 to 70 cents per gallon at the pump is going to Wall Street speculators. So if we want to provide real relief to the American people, we need to rein in speculation. But the Republicans, we've only got one watchdog out there, Commodity Future Trading Commission. They're supposed to set up position limits for non-participants, you know, people who are just speculating on price, not people who actually utilize these commodities. That hasn't been done. And they're otherwise under relenting attack, including a $10 million cut in their budget by the Republicans. So if we really wanted to do something to help consumers, we would pass this amendment, get a few more watchdogs downtown, put in place those position limits on speculators, and next May you wouldn't see prices run up a buck and a quarter, $1.50 a gallon like we see every May. That has to do with two things, refinery manipulation by the industry and speculation by Wall Street. We're not addressing either of those things. Today we're talking about putting more land up for leasing, but today, you know, we have a total of 35,397,010 acres of active leases, and the non-producing leases are 30,019,256, i.e., you know, that's about, you know, 85% of the leases are non-producing leases. They've got plenty of places to go now. It's in their interest to constrain supply somewhere along the way. It hasn't been on the side of production because we're exporting crude oil. We're still exporting gasoline even. It has been on the refinery side and has been speculation by Wall Street that's driven up the price. I urge adoption of this amendment. Reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I seek time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself as much time as I may.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, I rise to claim opposition to this amendment. And so let me be very, very clear. I do oppose this amendment. This amendment is costly and wasteful. The amendment would redirect $10 million away from federal permitting streamlining, which we know will help lower costs and produce more energy, and instead funnel money to another fruitless study of the unfounded position of somehow market speculation is impacting energy prices. Now, Mr. Chairman, earlier this year, researchers Christopher Niddle and Robert S. Pindyke from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Sloan's School of Economics, MIT, found that speculation wasn't driving up energy prices. And I will quote them, Mr. Chairman. I'm quoting right now. Back to those pesky speculators for a moment. Surely their bets on oil have had some effects on prices. According to our latest research, the answer is not really. In our recent paper, we explore the link between speculation and inventory changes. We calculate a series of speculation-free prices by creating a stable inventory of oil, providing us with a picture of what the market might look like in the absence of speculation. We focus on inventory for a simple reason. If oil prices are changing because of speculators, then there would have to be commensurate changes in inventories, a buildup of when prices are increasing and a drawdown when prices are falling. But when the economy was strong and oil prices were increasing, we didn't see large increases in inventories. In fact, they fell somewhat. This means that peak prices would have actually been higher if you take away the effects of speculation, end quote. Let me repeat that final part. When the economy was strong and oil prices were increasing, we didn't see large increases in inventory. In fact, they fell somewhat. That means that peak prices would have actually been higher if you take away the effects of speculation. Again, end quote. Time and time again, we have heard from those opposed to oil and gas drilling that it is the shady Wall Street speculator, the mind behind the curtain, that is driving up energy prices. The truth is that the best way to fight speculators or foreign cartels is simply to outproduce them. And that's what our solution here should be. We should be working to figure out a way how to use the more than 2% of our federal lands for energy development. We should find a way to have federal lands keep pace with private lands and the revolution of energy production that is currently taking place in the United States. Yet the Congressional Research Service tells us then, and I quote, all of the increase in federal 2007 to 2012 increase took place on non-federal lands, and the federal share of total U.S. crude oil production fell by 7 percentage points in that time. Yet, instead of reversing this trend, streamlining permitting, the gentleman, the author of this amendment, wants to siphon off money for studies. The legislation before us today is designed to streamline and produce more onshore energy production. This will create jobs and reduce our dependence on foreign imports. It demands an all-of-the-above energy agenda, and I would like to think that folks on the other side would at least embrace that part of it. So I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment and support the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
May I inquire as to how much time I have left?
2.5 minutes.
Okay.
Gentleman from Oregon has 2.5 minutes.
That I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady.
2 minutes.
From
The gentlelady
California.
from California is recognized for 2
Thank
minutes.
you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment today, which helps ensure that our derivatives regulator can protect our financial markets and economy. This amendment improves the funding situation of the CFTC by giving back $10 million that my Republican colleagues proposed to cut earlier this year. Many Americans are unaware that the CFTC is charged with enforcing laws designed to thwart Wall Street from manipulating the price of commodities, which affects the price at the pump and the cost of food on our plates. Just as importantly, the CFTC has been tasked with writing and enforcing rules reforming the financial markets and participants like AIG that contributed to the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. For these reforms to have teeth, we need a cop with the resources and staff to hold the financial industry accountable. And yet, despite the overwhelming need, House Republicans want to cut the CFTC's budget, deciding this year to provide the CFTC a funding level that is 40% below the President's request. This funding level is in addition to sequester cuts, which have caused temporary staff layoffs, as well as the agency-wide closure for 2 weeks during the Republican shutdown. Mr. Chairman, we're witnessing a multifaceted effort by the Republican majority to undercut laws and regulations, which Republicans and certain special interests disagree, halting Dodd-Frank rulemaking through litigation and legislation while simultaneously depriving our market cops of resources. The DeFazio Amendment is a first step towards countering this offensive by funding Wall Street's cop at a minimum with the same resources as last year. I thank my thoughtful friend from Oregon and urge adoption of this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California yields back. The gentleman from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am prepared to close if the gentleman is prepared to close, and I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Well,
the gentleman has 30 seconds remaining.
Then the head of, according to the MIT, then the head of ExxonMobil perjured himself under oath in the Senate. The Federal Reserve Bank at St. Louis is wrong because they have an in-depth study not paid for by the industry that says, indeed, speculation is a major factor. And I don't know how we can describe, here's over 1 month where you see the price vary by up to $11 per day. Now, are you telling me the supply changed by $11 worth in a day, and then, whoops, then the next day it's back down, and then when Ben Bernanke says that, here's a quote from when he said he saw a further decline coming, the industry tanks oil futures by $6. This is pure speculation. Don't defend it. Support the amendment and give the American people real relief from high gas prices that are unnecessary.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
How much time do I have remaining?
Gentleman has 1 minute remaining.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I know there is no truism specifically in economic theory, but one thing we do know about crude oil, and that is it is subject to international pricing. And we do know that a big part of the international pricing and production is conducted by a cartel, namely OPEC. Last figure I saw was about 45% of the international market. Well, when you have 45% controlled by one entity, you're going to have some price pressures that are coming. Indeed, you probably have some speculation. Mr. Chairman, this is the important part of what this underlying bill does, and the bill that we'll have on the floor tomorrow does. The only way that you're going to beat cartels is to outproduce them. I don't care if you're talking about crude oils, or if you're talking about apples, or you're talking about potatoes, or you're talking about timber. The whole idea, if you have somebody that controls a big part of the marketplace, the way you beat them is to outproduce them. This bill allows America to outproduce our foreign competitors. This amendment adds nothing to that, and I urge rejection of the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair,
On
the
that,
noes
Mr. Chairman, I
have it.
ask for recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. This is the gentleman from Washington seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise.
Question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having under consideration H.R. 1965, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 1965 and has come to no resolution thereon. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 420, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 1900 to provide for the timely consideration of all licenses, permits, and approvals required under federal law with respect to the siting, construction, expansion, or operation of any natural gas pipeline projects and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and ordered printed.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on the motion to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Any record vote on the postponed question will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 1545 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
And pass Senate Bill 1545, period.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 1545, an act to extend authorities related to global HIV/AIDS and to promote oversight of United States programs.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, if I may ask that all of our members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include any extraneous materials that they might wish to include on this resolution.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will yield myself such time as I may consume. Speaker, I rise in support of Senate Bill 1545. They call this the PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act of 2013. And it was just over a decade ago that AIDS threatened to decimate an entire generation of men and women and children around the world, and particularly in Africa. Without access to life-saving treatment, there was then no incentive to get tested. Without testing, it was impossible to detect and prevent new infections. In the hardest-hit countries, an estimated 35% of the population was HIV positive, and life expectancy in those countries dropped to as low as 34 years. The global AIDS pandemic was a massive humanitarian challenge, but it also threatened our economic and national security. The pandemic struck down men and women in their most productive years. The economies of emerging trade partners contracted. Socioeconomic conditions deteriorated. Tens of millions of orphaned children, forced to fend for themselves, became vulnerable to trafficking. They became vulnerable to criminality and recruitment by extremists. Infections among security forces in southern Africa was disturbingly high. It was against this backdrop that the United States mounted the most significant effort of any nation to combat a single disease in history. Authorized by Congress in 2004 and reauthorized in 2008, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR as we call it today, was a game changer and has since become among the most successful U.S. foreign aid programs since the Marshall Plan. Like many of my colleagues, I've been to Africa and witnessed the saved lives. Today, nearly 10 million people receive treatment supported by PEPFAR. 13 countries have reached a tipping point in their AIDS epidemic, the point where the number of adults on treatment exceeds the number of new infections. So across Africa, the new infections have declined by 33%. There is now hope that an AIDS-free generation may be within reach. We should be proud of that effort, but the United States cannot and should not do this alone. It is in our interest to ensure that our bilateral programs, our programs like PEPFAR, are complemented by an effective, efficient, and accountable global fund to fight AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. The PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act of 2013 provides a framework for the continuation of PEPFAR's success, and among other things, this legislation locks in important social values provisions mandated in the 04 and 08 bills that could be jettisoned if we don't move forward with this legislation. It improves transparency and reporting in a way that reflects the current direction of the program, and it extends limitations on U.S. participation in the Global Fund, including a 33% limitation on U.S. contributions and a 20% withholding requirement linked to transparency and management reforms at the Global Fund. So this bill, members, is time sensitive. During the week of December 1st, the Global Fund will convene a donors conference. Without the 33% cap and 20% withholding requirements firmly in place, which is what the bill does, the ability of the United States to leverage both our contributions and our reforms would be diminished. So I urge my colleagues to support this important, timely measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of S-1545, the PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I echo the words of my friend, the chairman. This important legislation, which passed the Senate by unanimous consent, reauthorizes key authorities that have helped the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, called PEPFAR, change the trajectory of the HIV/AIDS epidemic around the world. Before President Bush announced PEPFAR in his 2003 State of the Union address, and Congress passed authorizing legislation in May of that year, HIV and AIDS were ravaging the continent of Africa. By then, more than 25 million people had died from HIV/AIDS, and 14 million children had been left as orphans. Another 42 million people were infected, and though life-saving treatments had been developed, far too many people had no access to the medications necessary to save their lives. Therefore, PEPFAR became and remains the largest commitment by any nation to combat a single disease internationally. Today, nearly 6 million people are receiving life-sustaining antiretroviral treatment. Last year, more than 46 million people received HIV testing and counseling. Of these, more than 11 million were pregnant women, and as a result of treatment, the 1 millionth baby was born HIV-free this year. HIV/AIDS is no longer threatening to wipe out an entire generation on the continent of Africa. In fact, a sustained commitment by the United States to fighting this epidemic has made it possible for experts and researchers to talk about achieving an AIDS-free generation. PEPFAR is in the midst of an important transition as countries take on greater ownership of their HIV/AIDS programs. At this critical juncture, the PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act is an important demonstration of our ongoing bipartisan support for the fight against HIV/AIDS. This legislation also contains critical provisions that will enable Congress to provide the oversight necessary to ensure PEPFAR continues to save millions of lives while protecting our taxpayers' hard-earned money. The bill calls for continued coordination by the Inspectors General for the State Department, Department of Health and Human Services, and the U.S. Agency for International Development in conducting audits and oversight of the PEPFAR program. It also requires a more robust annual report from the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator, which will ensure better accountability. This legislation also extends key finding requirements for the treatment and care portion of the program, as well as funding for orphans and vulnerable children. Historically, the United States contribution to the Global Fund has been capped at 33% of total contributions. This cap has been an effective tool to leverage contributions from other countries, as well as to push for reforms as necessary within the Global Fund. However, when PEPFAR's authorization ended at the end of September, this 33% cap lapsed as well. I believe it's crucial that this 33% cap be reinstated going into the Global Fund Replenishment Conference, which will be the first week it will be held the first week of December here in Washington, and this legislation would accomplish this important policy objective. Mr. Speaker, by all accounts, PEPFAR has been an incredible success and a program we should all be proud to be a part of. I'd like to thank Ambassador Eric Gooseby, the recently departed United States Global AIDS Coordinator, for his hard work on behalf of PEPFAR and his lifelong dedication to those living with HIV/AIDS. I commend Chairman Royce, Representative Lee, and Representative Ross-Lehtinen, as well as Senator Menendez and Senator Corker, for their hard work on this legislation. It has been a pleasure working with all of them in such a bipartisan and bicameral manner. I would like to thank the House leadership for allowing this to come to the floor in a timely manner. And again, I think that Chairman Royce and I have shown that bipartisanship does exist in this conference, in this Congress. It certainly exists on our Foreign Affairs Committee, and this is a product of that bipartisan committee. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves his balance of his time. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I would, Mr. Speaker, continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, it's my honor to give 4 minutes of time to Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, who has been so instrumental in fighting for this legislation and other AIDS legislation for so many years in the Congress.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank our ranking member for yielding, but also let me just thank you so much for your tremendous leadership on this issue and on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and for your recognition and hard work in achieving and seeking to achieve an AIDS-free generation. I want to say it's a real pleasure to be with you today and to be back with you today, actually with the committee that I served on for 8 years, so thank you again so much. Let me also thank the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Royce, for ensuring that PEPFAR continues as a bipartisan effort. and for your commitment to an AIDS-free generation. And I just want to thank you for that leadership because, you know, oftentimes we wonder if there is bipartisanship in this body. Well, I think today, once again, we can cite that when it comes to saving lives, PEPFAR is a clear example of how we work together to do just that. And of course, I need to thank and must thank my co-chair on the Congressional HIV/AIDS Caucus, Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton from Florida. I have to thank her for her work on HIV and AIDS initiatives, both international and domestic. I'm very proud to have played a role in the creation of PEPFAR and proud about the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus and our chair at that time, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, even before the world knew about this program. Congresswoman Johnson knew the importance of presidential leadership and put this on the Congressional Black Caucus's agenda during our very first meeting with President Bush. To quote from a 2002 letter to President Bush, the CBC called for an expanded United States initiative to respond to the greatest plague in recorded history. And then following that, in President Bush's 2003 State of the Union speech, he laid out what this important initiative should look like and made a serious commitment to this effort. And so over the last decade, we've worked closely with the late Chairman Hyde, Chairman Lantos, as well as Senator Kerry, the late Senator Jesse Helms, Senator Bill Frist, Congressman Jim Leach, Congressman McDermott, Congresswoman Donna Christensen, Leader Pelosi, and so many. And I share this because I think it's important that this body recognize that the history of this has been bipartisan because we kept our eye on the prize. We knew that we wanted to save lives and we wanted to see an AIDS-free generation, and so many people, so many members of this body, so many outside organizations and our staff have worked so hard to get us to this point. And so now, a decade later, I'm especially proud once again to be a co-author of the bill before us today. As I said, this is a bipartisan compromise, and in the end, I think we have a very good bill. We agreed on the need to protect funding for HIV treatment and programs for orphans and vulnerable children. We agreed on the need to preserve support and extend the expired 33% cap on United States contributions to the Global Fund. This cap is a proven tool for leveraging donor funding and is especially important as the United States prepares to host the 4th Replenishment Conference on the Global Fund, or for the Global Fund, next month. Our bill also updates the annual report to better guide PEPFAR's transition toward greater country ownership while enhancing oversight. And I'm especially pleased that we included reporting requirements on efforts to engage key stakeholders, including faith-based organizations and United States minority-serving institutions. And I can tell you, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, PEPFAR has transitioned from, and this is very important, and I want to thank our ranking member Engel and our chairman, once again, Mr. Royce, for helping us realize the need to transition from an emergency response to a means of supporting country leadership in their work towards an AIDS-free generation. So this bill will fundamentally help continue to move our programs in that direction. May I have an additional 30 seconds?
Yes. Yield the gentlewoman 30 seconds.
The gentlewoman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank Ambassador Gooseby for his tremendous leadership, who actually lives in my congressional district in Northern California. Also, Dr. Mark Daibu, who now leads the Global Fund, and so many more. PEPFAR has supported nearly 6 million people on life-saving treatment, more than 11 million pregnant women who have received HIV testing and counseling, and 1 million babies born HIV-free this year. So this bill represents the real achievements that we can make when we put aside our differences and work together to achieve an AIDS-free generation. Thank you again.
Time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California continues to reserve. Yes, Mr. Speaker. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my great honor now to yield 1 minute to gentlewoman from California, our Democratic leader, who has, I think, done more than anyone else to fight for these things from almost the time that she came to Congress, Leader Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his kind words. It's just that I've been here such a long time, and when I first came to Congress, the mere mention of the word AIDS on the floor was something I thought was the most natural thing to do, but some of our colleagues squirmed at, and we've come indeed a long way from that time. And so today is a proud day as Democrats and Republicans come together to extend and reauthorize our efforts to fight the global HIV, AIDS, and infectious diseases in the poorest countries around the world. Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for working together to bring this important legislation to the floor today. And thank you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, for your unwavering leadership on these issues since day one that you came to the Congress. So many of our colleagues deserve recognition, and you acknowledge some of them. I will just add that this marks the 10th anniversary of the historic Tom Lantos-Henry Hyde U.S. Global Leadership Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria Act. This legislation has been the foundation of the U.S. initiative to provide sustained, constructive leadership in the global fight against AIDS. The original PEPFAR authorizing legislation, followed by the excellent work of the Appropriations Committee over the last decade, has provided life-saving antiretroviral treatment, care, and prevention for millions of people, especially focused on the most vulnerable infants and children. I have traveled on this AIDS issue for a very long time in our country and abroad, and I've seen firsthand the difference that PEPFAR has made. I've been to clinics where certainly you have, Mr. McDermott, Congresswoman Lee, and others who are here, Congresswoman, the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, Health Brain Trust, Congresswoman Dick Christensen, and now newer members, Mr. Himes, I see there, hopefully going to speak on this, and David, thank you for your leadership. But there's so many people, because what was wonderful about it is we went to places where people were so poor and so desperate and but they were not desperate that they were not without hope. And PEPFAR gave them hope, because they said originally we wouldn't even want anybody to know that we had AIDS. Why would we even be tested for AIDS? People found out that we had AIDS, but why would we even come to a clinic? What hope did we have? Well, PEPFAR gave them hope. It gave them a path. And so today we know, and Congresswoman Lee mentioned some of the figures, some bear repeating and some others I will mention. Treatment for over 5 million people, antiretroviral drugs for 750,000 pregnant women living with HIV to prevent mother-to-child transmission of HIV, averted 230,000 infant HIV infections in 2012 alone, HIV testing and counseling for almost 47 million people, and this year the 1 millionth baby will be born HIV-free because of the PEPFAR support. That means a child that might have been born HIV infected. A Congresswoman says that Dr. Gooseby lives in her district. His parents and where he was raised was in my district. So we all take great pride in his work. Over the years, we've made tremendous progress. First with President Clinton, we increased the bilateral programs to fight HIV/AIDS, and we helped create, authorize, and fund the Global Fund. And then under the leadership of President Bush, and this has to be a source of great pride to President Bush, and an important part of his legacy, we established PEPFAR and provided the necessary funding to ramp up the emergency response to the crisis. And I might add thank you to Bono for his role that he played in, again, ramping up the resources and making sure the public understood, as did those of us in elective office, and especially in the executive branch, where maybe this was a newer issue to them, that we needed to have the resources to make this happen. Thank you, Bono. Not only did he help us with the loan forgiveness to some of these same countries, but now to the alleviation of poverty, the eradication of disease. That is part of his agenda, and he worked with us to enhance our efforts. And President Obama has provided leadership as well and has strengthened those efforts and boosted our investments to put us on the brink of an AIDS-free generation. President Obama also is to be commended for lifting the travel ban on those with HIV, enabling the International AIDS Conference to return to the United States in 2012. I remember as a brand new member attending the conference in 1987 where this ban was in existence. It was an embarrassment that scientists could not come here, or people coming here with HIV/AIDS from whom we could learn, and there could be scientific collaboration. Well, that was not allowed because of the travel ban. But thank you, President Obama, for lifting it so that we can have a truly scientific, truly comprehensive conference in 2012 in the United States, very proudly. Today, the Congress will pass legislation to extend our global AIDS investment. Even in these difficult fiscal times, we know that cutting back is a false economy that costs more in the future. HIV/AIDS is still adapting, and so must we. It's a very resourceful virus. It just keeps finding ways, mutating and finding ways. And we have to be as resourceful or more resourceful in our fight against it. I thank you, the authors of the legislation, to the chair and ranking, for bringing the bill to the floor, for adapting our policies to meet the continued challenges posed by AIDS, TB, malaria, and deadly diseases around the world. I'm so pleased that we will probably have a unanimous vote on this important bill, and that is indeed an honor to be a part of. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, a very valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Cicilline.
The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, Leader Pelosi, and my colleague Congressman Lee for your strong leadership as a longtime advocate for a strong government response to the HIV/AIDS public health crisis in my home state of Rhode Island. And now, as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I rise today to strongly support the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief reauthorization. This year, we mark the 10th anniversary of PEPFAR, which has always enjoyed broad bipartisan support. First, in 2003, there was bipartisan support for addressing this public health emergency. Then in 2008, in response to some progress, PEPFAR transitioned into a more sustainable program with greater country ownership. Over the past decade, PEPFAR has significantly expanded access to antiviral therapy for those suffering from HIV and AIDS, which has led to a decrease in deaths from this devastating disease all around the world. We've made real progress because of PEPFAR, and we must remain vigilant and build upon this progress. The fight is not over. According to the World Health Organization, to date, almost 70 million people have been infected with the HIV virus, and about 35 million have died of AIDS. It's critical that the United States continue to be a leader in an increasingly international effort to eradicate this disease. Mr. Speaker, the role of the United States remains critical to combating the worldwide HIV and AIDS epidemic, and the PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act is a necessary and common-sense piece of legislation. This bill extends vital authority and strengthens oversight of the PEPFAR program, and most importantly, the bill would also extend the 33% limitation on U.S. contributions to the Global Fund. This cap has proven to be an effective tool for leveraging funding from other donor countries. Just 30 years ago, we knew almost nothing about HIV and AIDS, and we were not able to treat those who were suffering from this disease. To have made such progress since then is remarkable, and it's a real testament to what we can achieve when we work together in a bipartisan way. I urge my colleagues to vote yes and to continue our efforts towards an AIDS-free generation, which for the first time may be within our reach. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Rhode Island's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California continues to reserve. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, a classmate of mine.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I associate myself with all the remarks of my friends. We have had a remarkable occurrence in my time in the Congress. This was once a death sentence. Today we are on the verge of being able to produce an AIDS-free generation. Now, we're great and always excited when we do something new and big and exciting, but maintaining and pushing forward to finish the project is really where we are. This bill will pass without a vote against it, I'm quite sure. But the real question is, what do we put in the budget? Because if we don't maintain what's going on in the world today, we will lose, we will go backward. It's like a dike that we've built and we're holding back the sea. But the fact is that if we don't have the drugs available when mothers deliver children and you can do that intervention right at the appropriate time, you will not prevent the children from getting it. You will not be able to give the long-term care to the mothers as they raise these children. And in my view, that's really where we are. This was the crowning achievement, I think, of the administration of George Bush. His starting this was a statement to the world that the United States cared about an epidemic that affected the entire face of the universe. And we've done a good job. But the appropriations, and I worry, I say this because I worry about the sequester. What does sequester mean to this? What will be the reductions? Because I'm getting calls from my friends in South Africa and in Zambia and in Zimbabwe and Uganda and Kenya saying, how much money is there going to be next year? Will we be able to expand the program? Will we be able to keep it the same, or are we going to have to retrench? That's what the world is watching as we face this upcoming vote on the budget. I hope that we have as many votes for funding the program as we do for reauthorizing it here today in this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California continues to reserve. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Dr. Donna Christensen.
Gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I too rise today in strong support of H.R. 3177, the PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act of 2013. This year marks the 10th anniversary of PEPFAR, a program that has literally saved millions of lives in Africa and other hard-hit nations around the globe. Thanks to PEPFAR, more than 5 million individuals have received HIV and AIDS treatment, more than 46 million confidential HIV testing and counseling, and in 2012 alone, 750,000 pregnant women living with HIV received antiretroviral drugs to prevent transmission to their babies. This bill builds on the enormous strides that PEPFAR has made in its 10 years and bolsters oversight and reporting requirements. It also includes provisions that will expand international donor support, as well as continue to empower and enhance country ownership in health, thus promoting sustainability. Mr. Speaker, more than 100 organizations, most of which are on the front lines fighting this pandemic throughout Asia, Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and other highly affected countries, strongly support this bill. Our HBCUs, who have an important role to play, have also been advocates for it. I have worked and visited PEPFAR programs in Africa and the Caribbean and seen their effectiveness firsthand. They save lives. As a physician who has practiced for more than 20 years before coming here, I know what happens when individuals who are at great risk for HIV infection do not get accurate testing, education, counseling, or when those who are infected do not receive antiviral drugs. The outcome is disastrous. Mr. Speaker, also as a member representing a U.S. territory in the Caribbean, the world's second hardest hit region by HIV and AIDS, I cannot stress more strongly how vitally important our passing the PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act of 2013 is today. The lives of millions of individuals in our global community who are currently battling HIV and AIDS depend on it, and the health and wellness of millions more who are at risk for HIV infection but who are currently HIV-free depend on it. We haven't agreed on much that's health and healthcare related as of late, but this is one bill that we can and I'm sure we will agree on. And so I urge all of my colleagues to support H.R. 3177.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time is left?
Gentleman from New York has 4 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes.
Gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Engel, for yielding. And I'd like to thank the chairman and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee for the bipartisanship with which they have led this bill, in which I think we will accomplish some very good things tomorrow. The figures around this program speak for themselves. The millions of lives saved, the orphanages which are no longer full, the many pregnant women who will not transmit a deadly virus to their children. These things speak for themselves. This is, without question, PEPFAR and the Global Fund, one of the most effective foreign aid programs ever conceived in this chamber. But Americans might ask, in good faith, why spend money in places like Africa and Asia and the Caribbean when the needs are so intense right here at home? And the answer to that question could not be more clear. Africa and Asia, where PEPFAR and the Global Fund do the most good, are areas of great instability but of great promise, where countries like China are buying up commodities, are exerting their influence, are throwing their weight around. We have the opportunity, through the continuation of programs such as PEPFAR and the Global Fund, to win for generations the hearts and minds of people who will think back on American assistance as the reason that their family had continuity, as the reason that their country continued to develop. So the question we're answering when we think about continuing these programs and our involvement and our taxpayer dollars should really be, are we a country that offered the opportunity to continue to save lives? Will we do that? Do we want to save lives if we can? Do we want to be known just for our economic and military strengths, or do we want to also be known as an unqualified force for good in this world? I would say that at this point in our history, our ability to say that it's not just about economic and military power, but it is about a quality of mercy that we all cherish, that this is a wonderful opportunity for us to say who we are by supporting this legislation. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California continues to reserve. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
We can celebrate PEPFAR's 10 years of success in saving millions of lives by passing the bipartisan PEPFAR Stewardship and Oversight Act. Nearly 6 million people are receiving life-sustaining antiretroviral treatment and providing care and support to more than 4.5 million orphans and vulnerable children. That's PEPFAR. This bill extends critical authorities and strengthens programs oversight to ensure access to essential prevention and treatment services, and most importantly, this bill extends existing funding requirements for treatment for treatment of orphans and vulnerable children. We have brought to the world a tipping point in the fight against AIDS, and I urge all my colleagues to vote yes on this very important bill. I thank my colleagues who, like Barbara Lee, who have supported and initiated this amazing help for saving millions of lives, and thank the chairman for our ranking member for yielding to me.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California continues to reserve. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, let me just again say what I said at the outset. I want to thank Chairman Royce, and I'm really proud of this legislation as truly being a bipartisan product. We're doing something really, really good here today. We're doing something really, really that we can be proud of today. We're saving lives. And we're showing once again that the United States is the most compassionate nation on earth. And when all is said and done, isn't this really one of the greatest things that we can do? So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do think Mr. Elliott Engel of New York should feel proud about this bill. He's the original author of the House-passed version. I would say that in the interests of expediting this measure. He and we in the Foreign Affairs Committee worked, frankly, not only across party lines but across chambers in order to draft legislation that preserves congressional prerogatives, that advances U.S. interests, and, as Eliot Engel said so succinctly, that saves human lives. And this Senate bill does that. It achieves these objectives, and we worked in tandem with the Senate on Eliot's original draft to get this done. Now, this bill does not affect direct spending. It doesn't affect revenues. It does not create new programs or include major new policy provisions. I want the members to understand that. It is a streamlined, bipartisan measure that does extend critical PEPFAR authorities that expired, and it maintains the gains achieved through the 2008 reauthorization process. And I'd also like to recognize, besides the leadership of Mr. Engel on this bill, the work of Representative Ross Leitonen and Lee to help shape this measure, as well as efforts by our leadership to ensure that we do not miss this narrow window of opportunity to send this bill to the President's desk without further delay. I'd also share with our members that it helps get us on a path towards graduating countries from assistance. It conditions and limits assistance to the Global Fund. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 1545? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.